Skilly bing bong boo ba doop boop. It's time for another episode of
Let's talk about a comment.
Slightly different to the last one, because in my last video I said I could only make one research video a month. And this month I released 4 videos, although one was just thanks and the other was an interview. Still, I've got lots more to talk about. I also launched a Patreon, and one of the bonuses is you get to add comments to these videos. So starting with my beloved Patreon supporters, Stefan, my first Patreon supporter who found me out before I'd even published the page, so big thanks to him. He asks what my favorite pre-human hominid is. Hominin, homo, what have you. I don't have a favorite one. Neanderthals are interesting because they were so successful that we just have a lot more of them and a lot more to talk about, especially as they were our direct ancestors to a small extent. However, Homo erectus does not get the appreciation they deserve. I'm definitely going to make a video on them in the future, maybe even a series. They were globe traveling. They produced much more sophisticated stone tools than anything that had gone before, and they were probably the hominin that had mastered the use of fire, at least must have used it somewhat frequently. So shout out to Homo erectus, and stay tuned in the future for a video on them. Okay, moving on to my Neanderthals interview with Dr. Rag Sykes. Thank you to her again for participating in that. It's very cool. Farmer D says, consider that Neanderthals lived and hunted in the cold tundra. The warmer seasons must have been like it is now in the tundra climate, infested with mosquitoes. They could have used some of these materials for protection. That's an interesting idea, and you may well be right. In the interview, we were talking about what they might have used pigment and things like this for, if not for art. One of the suggestions was they would paint their bodies for various practical reasons. And it's true. I mean, you look at a video of Siberia now in the summer, it's hell on earth in terms of mosquitoes. If Neanderthals lived in that environment with their intelligence, they must have tried to somewhat alleviate being absolutely sucked dry by swarms of mosquitoes. So that's an interesting idea, Farmer D. You may well be right, and thank you for your comment. Claptrap, claptrap. What if Neanderthals made arrangements of twigs and feathers or weaving grass into shapes? What if they considered making permanent art that doesn't fade away sacrilegious? We'll never know what they considered sacred and sacrilegious. That's too complicated and we can't ask them. But you do bring up an interesting point in that the archaeological record has a huge bias. We only really get the stones and the bones. Very, very, very rarely is wood preserved from that time period. And I'm sure we'd be amazed at what they could do if that stuff was preserved. But hear this, let me speculate a second. Somewhere under the ice is a fully preserved Neanderthal. I'm convinced of this. In the same way that we discovered Ötzi, in the same way that we find the preserved remains of woolly mammoths and things like that. Somewhere out there, just waiting to be discovered, is a fully preserved Neanderthal with their clothes, their tools, everything. Hopefully we'll find it one day. Who knows? That would be the most incredible archaeological discovery that I think we have ever had. If you're into what archaeologists dig out of the ice, you should follow Secrets of the Ice on Twitter. Really cool group of archaeologists just sharing what they uncover as ice retreats. There's one small bonus of global warming. Moving on to my daily life in the Neolithic video, Ozymandias says, but did they understand that they were living on top of a hill that was made by their ancestors? This is in relation to Neolithic communities living on top of these man-made hills called tells. I do believe they would, because they still were participating in the construction of them at this point in time. You know, the Neolithic farmers were still destroying their houses and raising up these hills, and I think their oral history would have the ability to preserve the idea that it was their ancestors' homes that they were living on. Maybe it was sort of mythologized in their minds, you know, after 1,000 years of doing it, 2,000 years of doing it. they might have had all sorts of origin myths connected to their town. But I think on some level they would appreciate that they lived where their ancestors lived, and that their town was built on top of their ancestors' towns. I can only speculate because we can't ask them, but interesting point, Ozymandias. Thanks for watching. Luis Aldamiz, sorry if I said your name wrong. We can't say that the ancestors of Neo-Europeans were from Göbekli Tepe. We can trace their origins only to southern Anatolia, Çatalhöyük and such, but not that far east. Luis is 100% correct on this. Luis, you always, if you're watching, comment very thoughtful things on my video. I can tell you really know your archaeology, probably much better than I do. He's right. I know I used Göbekli Tepe as an example of monumental architecture, and I should really know better and be careful about this sorts of things because there are so many really wild theories about Göbekli Tepe. But I think the point that Catherine Perlet was trying to make in the source was that at the start of the Neolithic and in the pre-Neolithic, communities in the Near East produced monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe is just one example. There's also the tower at Jericho. Things like that. Monumental architecture is not unheard of in that area and in those communities. And we also see monumental architecture where the Neolithic reaches Western Europe. So it's just interesting that in that in-between geographical location and time in Greece and in the Balkans, we don't have evidence of this kind of construction. But as you yourself go on to say, these people were very complicated as we are. They weren't this monolithic group. We shouldn't expect them to behave in the same way across time and geography. But we can't help but notice the differences in the archaeological record and wonder about what caused them. I know you felt like I could have gone into a lot more detail into their symbolism and religious behavior with regards to these female figurines. You're 100% right, I could have done. It's just a hard balancing act, putting 1,000 years of history in a broad geographical area into 15 minutes. That's just a fault of my video making process, and people should really view my all of my videos as just sort of a brief guide, because there's always so much more that can be said about these sorts of things. Thank you, Luis, for your comment. I hope you continue to watch and comment on my videos because you really know your stuff and it's always very interesting. So thank you. All right, moving on. JM. You are confusing ancient Athenians with Greek name. Ancient Greeks, dozens of question marks. Laugh, 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 laugh. Now, JM clearly is a man who is heavily invested in the naming controversy between Macedonia and Greece. I got a lot of comments like this about names and ethnicities in both the Neolithic video and the Mesolithic video, and it's worth talking about. In my opinion, it is pointless for us to project modern ethnicities, even ancient ethnicities, as far back as the Neolithic and the Mesolithic, because we have no idea how they refer to themselves or what they considered to be their people, their culture, their nation, if you will. We can only look at similarities in DNA and similarities in material culture and make assumptions around that. This also brings up the point of, are ethnicities defined by haplogroups? There's a big tension in archaeology between the archaeologists and ancient geneticists. Archaeologists often feel that ancient geneticists should be more careful in their language because ethnicity is not just a haplogroup. There's more to being British than a haplogroup. You've got to eat shepherd's pie, for example. I think we care too much about haplogroups. We should use them to understand the past, but that doesn't really have too much of a bearing on modern politics, in my opinion. Also, if I don't use the term Greece and the Balkans, no one's going to know what I'm on about if I use some obscure geographical term. I don't even know the geographical term for this area. It's just Greece to me. So ease of communication has to be taken into account, Mr. JM. All right, moving on to the Mesolithic video. This video got some really crazy comments. Timothy McKee what happened to the hunter-gatherers? The liberals taxed them to death. Mr. McKee, pay your taxes. I plan on having at least 35 children, and I want them to go to a good school, so pay your taxes. That's all I've got to say about that. John Salvage, based on the supposed we were all fish once theory, which means we came from the shorelines all over the earth when the seas lowered, Europeans never came from Africa. John Salvage, we were fish hundreds of millions of years ago. It has no bearing on the out of Africa theory. This video wasn't even on the out of Africa theory, which is hugely backed up by archaeological and genetic evidence, so you need to check your sources, sir. Super long Irish name person says, why are you assuming that these two groups were intermarrying rather than one group capturing the women of a rival group? This is in connection to the 9 out of 10 non-local burials at Lepenski Vir are believed to be women. Let me flip that assumption back on you. Why do you assume that just because it was the Stone Age that there was some sort of sexual violence involved in how these groups interacted? Now, it's naive of me to say that there was no sexual violence. Of course, it occurred then as it occurred now. But the majority of human interaction in any time period, I feel, is peaceful. Neolithic farmers wanted to live in peace. We want to live in peace. And I don't think there's any reason for us to suppose that sexual violence was the majority of how these two groups interacted. Especially because at Lepenski Vir, contact with Neolithic people seems to have really encouraged their development socially, artistically. You know, why not say that it was women causing this cultural renaissance? That's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to come to from the evidence. I flip that assumption back on you, sir or madam. Last comment, let's finish on a high. Dan Burrows on my 20,000 subscriber thank you video. Well done, Stefan, you beautiful, balding bastard, XOXOX. I appreciate it, Mr. Barrows, even though you spelt my name wrong. Brought into my receding hairline into question, and also insinuated that my birth was not legitimate. I appreciate you, and thanks for watching, subscribing, all of this stuff. Thank you to everyone for your Patreon support, the comments, the subscriptions, the views. I read every comment. I love it. I can't reply to them all, but I read them all. This month, in 3 weeks, there'll be another big video coming out, and I will respond to the comments again in this format. Thank you. See ya.